I bake sourdough in there. That's in a Dutch oven. It's covered for 1 hour at 500 degrees. Actually, after doing so, my oven becomes hard because it's also getting up to that temperature, and the food inside there is hard and it's covered and all that. So it'll actually kosher the oven. So if you need to do that, you can actually turn it on for an hour at 500 degrees, and that would kosher the oven to the status. Now, another thing I want to mention, we don't engage in the behavior of going back and forth and koshering from milchiks to fleishiks on a constant basis. We'll learn about that soon. But once in a while, for a reason, or if you're going from parv and then parv to milchiks, that's a way to do this. Okay, I just want to give you the introduction. Let's learn inside, and then if you have questions, feel free to ask. So we're on the bottom of page Chavzayin. Hakshoras hatana in b'mikra nasa hatana b'sori. If the oven becomes fleishiks, if you want to be able to cook dairy foods in there, without a cover, some say you can kasher the oven through cleaning it well. The Yamtin Esrim Rabishas wait 24 hours. Plus Yafilas Atan, then you turn on the oven to the highest temperature for 1 hour. Some say, some question this. But I discussed this with the Lubavitcher Pesach, and he accepted this. He said it's an acceptable way to kasher, and therefore I'm comfortable with it. And that's that. What about a mic? First of all, any questions? Yes.
Does 500 degrees for 1 hour koshers it, but does it make a difference if there's any like leftover residue after that or before that? Like if there's like burnt meat at the bottom, you should take it away, or 500 degrees will just like nullify it.
So it should be surface clean when you're koshering it for that kind of purpose at 500 degrees. If you're koshering at 900 degrees, everything would mamish be nullified. But if you're doing a lower level koshering, it should be like surface clean. You don't have to worry about any stains, but if you see any surface clean, just no actual residue you can touch. But
Right.
don't worry about any stains on the wall, right? Anything like that. Yeah.
For the 500 Fahrenheit koshering, do you have to like clean it and then wait 24 hours and then do that, or?
So there are those that say that you before koshering it from milchiks to fleishiks, you have to wait 24 hours. But I asked Rabbi Kasimov, and he told me that it's not required. If you're going from kosher to kosher, and certainly if you're going from kosher from milchiks, let's say fleishiks to parv, that's for sure not a problem. You don't have to wait 24 hours. But even if you're going all the way from fleishiks to milchiks, some wait, some say you don't have to wait. Okay, and now if you're koshering it, like I said before, let's say it's for Pesach or from non-kosher to kosher, then the actual self-cleaning cycle of 900 degrees would burn anything out in its place. You don't even have to clean the oven really. So it's going to just burn it all up to it.
And if you don't have that option in the oven, then
If you don't have the option in the oven, it becomes a little more complex. So if it's an oven from non-kosher, to speak to a rabbi how to guide you, there's a few things you can do. One thing to do is to buy new racks. You can also kasher the racks outside the oven. An oven could be torched by covering the thermostat, but it's a very tricky thing to do. There are things that could be done, but it should be done with the professional guidance.
Most ovens, when you put it on self-clean, it automatically goes to 900 degrees. Like
A
when you
real
make sure that
self-clean will, but some of these ovens have what's known as a steam cycle. That's not a self-clean cycle.
No, so let's say you put it on self-clean, it's not called steam.
If it's a real self-clean, it should get up to 900 degrees. You can look it up on the manufacturer's website of the specs of that oven, but usually a self-clean, that's what it means, but not a steam cycle. Okay. A microwave is interesting because it has features about it that are similar to an oven, but it's also a little bit different because it works with rays. So Din Taner microgal, which is halacha chafches on the top of page chafches, Doimeladin kind of gas, it's similar to a gas oven. One could use it for meat and for dairy. If one of them is covered. In other words, if it's a meat oven, if it's a meat microwave, and I always double cover my dairy in there, it's okay. Okay. גם יש להקפיד לא לשים כלי מיוחד מתחת למאכל חול וכלי אחר מתחת למאכל בשר. To put a separate like tray or something down on the tray itself, if you're using it like that, double wrap. Some say you can kasher on microwave, kishenesar, if it became also imam if you wait 24 hours, how do you kasher it? You take a cup, like a styrofoam cup full of water, and then you turn on the microwave until the whole cavity of the microwave gets full of steam. Basically, let's say for the cavity of the microwave would be the size of this safer. So I'm going to put, let's say, 3 or 4 cups, and they're going to steam out. It's going to create the whole thing is going to get steamed. The area where the cups are sitting, I just move around halfway through so that the area under that, the cups are going to get hit with steam as well. And that would be considered acceptable. I'll take your question in a moment. Some opinions say that one should not kasher a microwave from treif to kosher or from chametz to Pesach. And some, but you may kasher an oven kosher to kosher, like from kosher meat, kosher dairy, or kosher dairy to kosher meat. But some Rabbanim do allow even kashering a microwave from chametz to Pesach and from treif to kosher. So what I advise people when they ask me this question is if you have a tabletop microwave, which are not expensive, I believe they're like, $80. I mean, I'm not trying to make little of it, but it's not a huge amount of money. If a person can afford it, they should really try to be machmer and not kasher the microwave and treif to kosher. It's the Pesach. If it's a built-in microwave that's right on top of the stove, those cost a lot more money. I think they could cost probably $400 or $500, maybe more. So it's a little bit more of a consideration. There are those that allow the kashering of it, and the person could speak to their Rav about the matter. And if someone wants to do so, they have who to rely on. Yes, question. Okay. That's why I like questions at the end, right? I've given this class for 20 years, so I'm trying to give the information. Be'ezah Hashem with Hashem's help. Okay, now Chav Tes gets into rustic kitchen. You go to some of these, for example, you go to one of these rustic restaurants. They'll have like a brick wall. They'll have the pots hanging right on top of the stove. So it's very nice. It has a nice look, an open kitchen look. But it could be a kashrut issue if you have, let's say, a tall pot of chicken soup that's brewing and bubbling, and you have a dairy pot hanging low, right? So that the steam of the chicken soup is going to hit the dairy pot while the steam is still hot. Too hot to touch. That would cause a forbidden absorption in the dairy pot. Now, very often these hanging pots are not that low because then the chef is going to bang their head and will be in a bad mood. So it's not so likely to have, but it could just be mindful of it. So basically what I would say, advise people is you need about, I would think, 3 feet of headspace, from the lowest hanging pot to where the highest pot on the stovetop is, right? You have that amount of headspace. By the time it's going to travel 3 feet, it already won't be too hot to touch because the ambient air would cool things down. Just be mindful of that. It's a potential issue. It's very common in commercial kitchens, by the way. But in commercial kitchens, when you give an hechsher, they won't have dairy and meat at the same right next to each other, on separate sides. So this issue is avoided from that perspective. Okay, halacha lamed. Chatzuvos, which is referring to the actual grates that the pots sit on. You have the actual burner, but then you have a metal grate that's a position to give you a flat surface for the pot to sit on. So the question becomes, do the grates have to be kasher or do they have to be dedicated? One grate for milchiks, one for fleshing. for the pot. The grates in which the pot sit on, it's not required to have separate ones for meat and dairy. One would be allowed to use a grate to cook or to cook a meat food and then a dairy food, or a dairy food and then a meat food. Any spillage that we'd be concerned about. Let's say some chicken soup spilled from the meat pot onto the grate. You have fire there, so it would be burned up right away. So it wouldn't really remain as any food residue. It would be burned up and get kosher. Ulam, however, this is a word of caution. If one sees food residue on the grate, you have to clean it before cooking the opposite kind on it. So if you see a clump of cheese there, yes, you don't put down your meat pot and start cooking chicken soup. There are those that are stringent, and they dedicate grates, one for meat and one for dairy. And there's an expression, Yisrael Kedoshim Haim, the Jewish people are holy people, and we try to dedicate one. So, practically speaking, in your kitchen, you'll have 4 grates on your stovetop, or 6, depending what kind of stove you get. If you're cooking par food, you can use any one. It's not an issue. If you're going to cook actual fleishiks, actual milchiks, it's better to have ones that are dedicated. Okay, this is for fleishiks, this is for milchiks. And if necessary, you can just turn them on for 15 minutes to kasher them also. It burns them out. It's just the way it works. Okay, any questions on what I said so far? Yes.
I was just thinking about this steam. Like when I think you might have mentioned it, but like salt shakers or like pepper shakers, like when you're doing it over the.
Yes, we've learned about that before. One should be mindful not to spray salt or even to squeeze ketchup or mustard over a steaming food directly. The place was really going to get hot. So what you could do is just put it on the side of the plate. Let's say some people like to have ketchup with their pizza. You can put it on the side of the plate, and or if you want to have ketchup with any other food, put it on the side of the plate. Be mindful of that, so you're not going to have a problem. It's not so common to have a problem because by the time the food hits your plate, it could still be steaming hot. But after a few minutes, it's going to cool down. But it could happen because a solid food does retain its heat. It's still a davar gush. Very good point. Thank you for asking this. Yeah.
Does this apply to all seasons?
It applies to all spices. So I think I mentioned this, but I'll just reiterate. My mother, of blessed memory, I remember when she would cook, she would pour the spices into her hand and then go into the pot. She wouldn't pour any spice directly over a hot pot. So if you're using spices interchangeably for meat and dairy, some people, if they have separate sides and the separate spices, great, but it's not required. Just have it, don't directly go from the spice into the pot. There's another advantage of being mindful of this. It also prevents webbing in the spices, which can give infestation as well. Because the moisture will create infestation. Spices and any powders and any things like that, nature, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now we'll get any other questions or we're good? Okay, now I want to introduce the next topic. It's within the halachas of bas b'chol, but it's a new category. Okay, so now we're going to discuss a rabbinic prohibition. Whenever we discuss a rabbinic prohibition, the rabbis set parameters for what's prohibited and under what conditions it's prohibited and what's not prohibited. We're not talking about something that's written expressly in a pasuk where the pasuk says whatever it is. The Chachamim established parameters for a very important reason, of course. And they said as follows: we're not permitted to make a food like bread. We're not allowed to make it dairy or make it meat, which means to say we're not allowed to actually put dairy ingredients in the actual mix of the bread. So we're going to have a dairy bread, and we're not allowed to do the same thing with meat, to have a meat bread. What's the reason for this? Because bread is a staple food. Allah pas yechia right? Pas b'melach toicha, we have pipiyavis, and bread is something that accompanies a meal. Chachamim said it must remain neutral, because if it's going to be dairy, we're concerned that somebody's not going to realize, and they're going to bring this dairy bread to their Fleishig Shabbos table, and they're going to come to stumble on Basa B'chol, which is a Torah prohibition. So as a safeguard, to prevent such a possibility, they said you're not allowed to make bread, dairy, or meat. Now, the same Chachamim who made this prohibition also gave parameters. And part of the parameters that they installed are that only when the bread that becomes dairy and the meat that becomes meat is not recognizable as meat bread or dairy bread, is it prohibited. But you are allowed to make the akacha pizza that out of meat, for example, that take bread, put strips of meat on top of it. You're allowed to do that because the meat is right there and a person sees black and white, this is meat. The concern is only when it's not visibly meat or not visibly dairy, we're afraid a person's going to make that mistake. And there's another interesting thing here which we're going to learn about. The Chum also said that if a person bakes the bread in a very unusual shape, that's going to serve as a reminder for the family that this is dairy bread or this is meat bread. I remember as a child, it struck me so deeply. It was Purim time. My last name is Hanoka, so it's a very personal story. So for Mishloach Mones, one of our neighbors gave us menorah bread. It was bread in the shape of a menorah, and it was dairy. But it's permissible to do that because the shape of the bread was so unusual. So you have the actual telltale sign in the bread itself, in the shape itself. And the rabbi said there's a third way to do it in a permissible way would be if you bake enough bread to finish in one day. So let's say someone bakes a small batch of bread, and let's say it's a household of 5 people, and it's they bake 7 little rolls, 8 rolls, right? It's going to be finished by the family in one day, and they make a public announcement in the family. You should know that this is a unique type of recipe. It's all dairy. So we see people are going to remember because it's something that happened fresh that day. It serves as a reminder. But what's fascinating is that the halachic codifiers, they point out that this idea of making the bread in a funny shape only helps if it's not the normal shape. If you have a manufacturer who suddenly decides to make bread in the shape of menorahs, then its novelty wears off. It becomes a standard. So the whole idea of it becoming an unusual shape is only if it's not the standard shape. It's not being done by the manufacturers. It's only being done in Revitz and so-and-so's house. So it's unusual. It retains its novelty. Okay? It's just some background on it. Some further background on it. By the way, the Frierdiker Rebbe, he gives summaries after all the Maimorim, after every ois, after every chapter. He would give a little summary. Some is also have like a preface. It's geschmack when you know what we're talking about. When you're inside, you're ready comfortable. So what about pastries? So pastries that are sweet are not something that's the norm to eat together with meat. You eat it after a meat meal, but we don't eat it together with meat. The concern here is that because bread is eaten together with meat, right? You'll take the bread, have it with the gravy, whatever. That's where we're concerned on actual basa b'challah. When it comes to pastries, it is permissible. We pass them. It's permissible to bake pastries that are dairy, the sweet. Okay, I wanted to point that out. There's a difference. Okay, let's look at it inside. Halacha and Aleph H Tes. Lechem chalavi dairy bread. Gozra Chazal, the rabbis prohibited. They establish in lolush isa b'chol. We're not allowed to knead bread with dairy. They're afraid maybe you're going to come to eat the bread with meat. Also, lolush isa b'shulman basar. You're not allowed to knead bread with meat fat. You're afraid you might come to eat it with dairy. Because that's the norm, to use bread to eat it at a meal with meat or dairy. So because it has that norm, it has to retain its neutrality. The rabbi said that it's a very severe prohibition. If someone did inadvertently bake bread with dairy, the bread may not be considered, you're not allowed to eat it. You're not even allowed to eat it by itself. Because you might come to have it with meat, and that's a common thing. So that's the basis of the prohibition. That's the logic behind it. But I said there are three possibilities where there could be exceptions if one has an unusual circumstance, right? If you make something unusual with the bread itself. So din pasketan or lamed base. Someone only baked a very small amount, enough for 1 day's worth. The family would eat those 7 rolls in 1 day, family household of 5, for example. We're going to eat it all up in 1 day. We're not afraid you're going to have it with meat. You're going to remember, oh, today's bread was fresh, etc. It has a certain kind of, it carries a certain spirit with it. Oh, we know it's this. Even if you make more than one person's portion, if you have a lot of people in the house, and all of them together collectively would eat it in 1 day, muteres gamkin is permissible. And the third way to make it permissible, I'd say second way would be to make it that someone made the dairy bread in an unusual shape, like the example I gave you about the menorah bread. You remember, oh, this is the unusual bread, this is different. You're going to remember, and you're not going to come to eat it with meat. So we see that the Chacham and the rabbis were concerned about a situation which is likely to be mixed up. If you don't have any discerning factors, we're afraid you're going to get mixed up. But when you have a discerning factor, we're not worried about somebody losing their sense of clarity. We don't have to be worried about unusual things. It has its own simon, it's okay. So if you make an unusual shape, and it's not considered to be the norm, you're even allowed to make more than enough for 1 day for your family. Now we turn to page Lamed on top. The third thing is that if it's completely obvious that this bread is meat. For example, focaccia meat pizza, right? You make it with strips of meat on top, with some tomatoes, whatever it is. They get the Italians to give you the exact delicious recipe. You see actual strips of meat there. Or you see that it's dairy, like that's what pizza is all about. It's a piece of dough, but it has cheese on top, and or something that has cheese in it. Muta gavkin lafreis, you're allowed to bake it, so that's permissible. By the way, orekas, which are like nishes, in Eretz Yisrael, I'm told that must be the Shadim got together that certain shapes are dairy and certain shapes are proper. I don't remember which is which. They established a system because wrapped dough products are very confusing because it's wrapped when you can have cheese inside there, you can have meat inside there, and it's not always so discernible unless it's oozing out. So they established a system where they have different shapes for different ones, which is a very, very smart to do, as long as it's kept that way. Now we're going to talk about pastries. Okay. Halacha lamed ugos samamulas potatoes. You have, let's say, dough filled with fruit fillings like pies and pastries. Not the norm to eat that together with a. You wouldn't take like a cheese Danish, or a person would take, let's say, a cynical Danish. They wouldn't have that with a meat meal because you don't eat together with meat. It's two separate mouthfeel experiences. It doesn't really work together. So therefore, we're not concerned about it. Rather, people eat it as a dessert. Therefore, we're not concerned you're going to come to eat it with meat. That's why you're allowed to make pastries, dairy. You can make a cheese Danish, you can make a butter croissant, whatever it happens to be, because we're not concerned you're going to come to eat it together with a meat meal. One more halacha, and then that wraps up this particular subject. This prohibition about making bread, dairy, without it having a discerning shape gets established at the time of the baking itself. Since the bread becomes prohibited at the time of the baking, In Lehetelir, it doesn't have any, it's not permissible. Marshall, for example, let's say someone made a lot of loaves of bread, they made them dairy, and after they're baked already, you decide I'm going to give it out to my friends. And each one's going to get enough for one day. Only enough for one day. You bake bread in a regular shape. After baking it, you made a shino in it. They found in all these ways, they did not actually make the bread permissible. It remained usher with the prohibition that it had the time of the baking itself. Because the prohibition, it lands and it takes root at the time of the baking. If it was baked in a predicament that's not permissible, it can no longer become permissible later. Just like we have a concept that labeling is disabling, right? When a label sticks, so in halacha, once something it attains a certain status, this was baked in a non-permissible way, you can't suddenly, after it's baked, give it out and make it permissible. Not permissible anymore.
What's the label thing?
It's a very fascinating question. So if you label something as dairy, Yeah.
With the cheese inside the bread.
so if the cheese is oozing out, you have that can help you. But labeling it itself, I don't think is going to help, because you have a similar question, okay? Similar question that we're going to learn. We're not going to really learn about it so much here, but if someone's going to have, let's say, a soy milk, and they're going to put it into a coffee, so it's a meat meal. Or someone, let's say, has an oat milk that looks exactly like regular milk. If someone, let's say, puts it into another glass jar, is it marasayan? Does it look like wrong? Because hey, they're pouring milk into a coffee, with a meat meal or something. Do you have to have a label? Does the label even help? So I've heard different answers about it. Some say that the label itself doesn't serve as a siman, doesn't serve as a hekah, because it's just telling you what the product is. It's not the siman means you're doing something different. And we don't find, with regards to this prohibition, that it's enough to label something. We find that if you make it a funny shape, or you make only enough for one day, or you find the dairy or the meat visibly obvious, that's allowed. We don't find labeling it to be a pass to allow it, so to speak. Any other questions? Yes?
I think, when people make those in a system like that, and they put like continued after that, maybe it should be more exciting. They put the sugar like this.
It's an interesting question. It could be monosayan. First of all, a lot of the vegan cheese doesn't look exactly like cheese. It looks similar. That's one difference. Some say that because it's so common today to have vegan cheese, you should still say on it vegan cheese to make it clear. So, before one actually does, they speak to a Rav for guidance. But I believe that's there are those that would hold us acceptable. I have a company that makes a gluten-free pizza crust, and the pizza crust itself is kosher. They have a separate department that actually tops it off with cheese. So the actual hard cheese is non-kosher. The separate area is all cold. But they have a vegan cheese that they use, which is kosher, but it looks very different than another regular cheese. Very yellow, it's very different kind of look. I don't know if all vegan cheese looks different than regular cheese, but I would think it might look a little bit different. Okay, halacha lamed vav. We have a choice now. We have like 7 more minutes. Tell some stories or finish the subject.
I guess I'll ask another question.
Okay, go ahead.
The distinguished whatever, in order for something to be distinguishable, it has
Yeah.
to be visible before we put into it, or it could be distinguishable just by into it, like, someone puts cubes of cheese in the bread, and once you cut it, you could clearly see that the cheese is.
It has to be distinguishable before it's baked. So that's when you're establishing it. Okay, I'll tell a few stories. Today is a special day in my family. It's today's Begisha. You see that was a group here. So my father actually started the Begishas in 1961. The Rebbe asked for it, and today's my father's birthday.
Oh,
Uh, my father passed away 15 years ago, so he would be 90 today. I want to tell some stories about his life. He had a fascinating life, and he had a very close relationship with the Rebbe. He came to the Rebbe, by the way, this time of the year. He met Lubavitch, Pashas Lech Lecho, and he came to the Rebbe. He had yichus with the Rebbe at the end of Cheshvan, and then he eventually enrolled in 770, 6 weeks later. But when he enrolled, he barely knew Aleph Beis. He was a college student, a scientist, and a budding scientist. He became a scientist later, and came from a Sephardic family. Didn't know very much of anything. He just was thirsty to learn. So he enrolled in 770. That the administration did not want to accept him because they had no program for him. So the Rebbe kind of gave him a hint and said, if I were you, I'd accept him. Accept him, but be tens of thousands more like him, hundreds of thousands more like him, and then they accepted him, and they gave him the Gemara with Yiddish translation, which was as good as Portuguese because he didn't know Yiddish either. But he said he didn't learn too much, but he absorbed from the experience, the atmosphere. And the Rebbe told him, the Rebbe gave him a lot of personal guidance. The Rebbe said to him for the first 3 months, and the Rebbe said for the first 6 months, don't ask yourself what you're doing here because you won't be able to answer the question. And then my father said after being in 770 for a while, he felt like this is it. I'm where I belong. And after being there for 2 years, the Rebbe told him to finish his degree, to finish his science degree, to get his PhD. And my father wanted to become a rabbi, a Hillel rabbi. He thought he'd become a Hillel rabbi. And the Rebbe went to university. The Rebbe was a college graduate. So the Rebbe used some academic terms. The Rebbe said, you'll do more for Judaism with 3 initials after your name, PhD. And then the Rebbe gave him 3 reasons why he should do it. One reason was he'll be able to, he already invested many years into this, he was halfway through. So this way he can elevate all the years that he already invested. Another reason was you'll do more for Judaism with 3 initials after your name. And the third reason was my father was an only son. My father has 3 sisters. And my father's from a Sephardic family. In a Sephardic family, sons of the flower are exalted in the Sephardic family. No offense to the females, but that wasn't what the Rebbe was getting at. But my father was an only son, and my father's father was unable to go to university because he had to support his family when he was my father's father, meaning my father's grandfather, passed away at a very young age. My father's father supported his mother and siblings. After high school, he would work a night job, and his whole dream was that his son will become a scientist. So my father said, because of honoring your parents, you should also do it. So anyway, so he did it, and my grandparents didn't know what hit them because the son became Bohan, didn't know what the Lubavitch was. They were very respectful about the whole thing, but they really didn't know what it was, and it was a very big adjustment. And my father's father's mother, my father's grandmother, paternal grandmother, lived with them because she was a widow. She lived with her son and daughter-in-law, and the Rebbe came to her in a dream because they were concerned. The Rebbe said, "Don't worry about your grandson; you'll have a lot of matas coming." And there was a lot of fascinating discussions my father had with the Rebbe. My father was a very, very practical person. He spoke very, very open. He didn't look, didn't, but he was, I wouldn't say he was blunt, but he was just very open with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said to him, do you have spending money to be able to? My father said to the Rebbe, I could always tutor students here in English, and study them like that. The Rebbe said, no, you're here to study Torah. The Rebbe offered to lend my father money. My father said to the Rebbe, if I need money, I'll get it from my parents. But didn't want to take the Rebbe's money. And we have a the Rebbe saw my father with a bunch of other academics from those years as like the poster boy for what's going to be, what's going to come in the future. And the Rebbe said that my father later in life, he said, I want you to speak publicly so people can see you could be an academic. It could be a Yid with a beard, totally committed to Yiddishkeit. And the Rebbe believed in his mission. And the Rebbe had this collection of academic students. And the Rebbe spent a lot of time in them because the Rebbe was showing American Jewry that it's not a contradiction. You can have a career and serve Hashem and be totally committed to Yiddishkeit. And the Rebbe also guided my father thinking.
Sir, 1 minute.
Yeah.
Girls, when the class is over, I just want to let you know, the food downstairs is for you girls also. But there is a class downstairs that's going to be starting with Mrs. Namney for the college students from 10 to 10:30. You're welcome to go down, get your coffee, tea, food. But your davening will need to be upstairs, and when you're downstairs, it'll already be a class, so please just go by. Okay, thanks.
So the Rebbe has a collection of academics, and the Rebbe wants each and every one of them to show that you can live and be totally true to Yiddishkeit. And the Rebbe also told my father that be very careful when you work in an industry, give your bosses an honest day's work, because they're going to be looking at you of what an example of a Jew is. My father always worked a little bit extra. He would work extra, and he would work on secular holidays. And it was a wonderful thing because it helped the company when he had to take off for Yom Tov, but the Rebbe gave him a lot of guidance. And Mitzvah Shem to play some more, but it's the Rebbe's words. It lives forever. This is tremendous stuff. Anyway, you have to be careful with me. Once I start telling you these things, I don't stop. So that's good. It's good I said at the end of class, but I have to stop.
Thank you.
Tell us at some point how your father started Kedusha.
Yeah, I'll tell you. But basically, what happened was when my father came, the Rebbe told his secretary. He asked him to reach out to my father. Maybe they can make a program for college students winter time during winter break. Ask my father if they can give up, come here for winter break. My father's response was he doesn't know if they'll give up the whole 12-day winter break, but they'll come for a Shabbos. The Rebbe said a Shabbos is also good, and they started a program. The first Shabbos was in Crown Heights, 1961 or 62. It was held in a basement. There was a small group, 17 people with pigtail lights, very humble beginnings. That was how he started. And then thereafter, my father ran it, and he used to write all the brochures, most of the brochures, and the Rebbe wanted a very detailed report. Well, he was a very humble person, didn't tell us too much. After he passed away, my brother went through his whole draw. There were like 10-page reports. I have copies of this. I can even give you a book that we printed on it. It's not ready. We have to bring next week. You go through to share. But the Rebbe wanted like every detail. He wanted to know the reaction of the people that came, what could be done better, what topics they spoke about. And the Rebbe had a very interesting criteria. He says the speakers don't have to be Lubavitch. They have to just be religious Jews. So it was very interesting. They
Similar to what JLI thinks.
yeah. So but the rest of also there was one speaker that just stood out. He was a person who took ideas in Tanya and connected them with science. And wrote the details. This was in the booklet. And the Rebbe really liked that very much and wanted more of that. But to bring it alive.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Shem, I'll bring you the booklet. And if you want to look online, if you look in the hair, there's a magazine called Picture the Hair. There was an article by my father published about 5 years ago. Talked about his whole life story with all the things in the Rebbe. And when I gave out a booklet and at some wedding, and some of that other stuff. I'll bring a book in Mr. Shem next week.
Thank you.
Good job.
So much. Good Shabbos. Up. Oh, what's it?
No, but I'm going outside.
Okay. I mean.
Oh, what?
Love. Love doors.
I don't.